The real reason you can't say no. It's not what you think. You've done it before. Someone asks you for something, your time, your energy, your Saturday, and before you've even finished processing the question, you hear yourself say yes. Not because you wanted to. Not because you had the bandwidth. Not even because you particularly liked the person asking. But yes came out anyway. And in the half-second before you said it, something happened inside you. A flicker. A quick internal calculation you weren't entirely conscious of. Something that felt less like a choice and more like a reflex. Here's what most people assume about that moment. They think the yes came from kindness. From generosity. From being a good person who doesn't want to let people down. And maybe some of that is true. But underneath the kindness, underneath the people-pleasing, the overcommitment, the chronic inability to hold a boundary, there is something else entirely. Something older. Something more precise. The inability to say no is not a personality trait. It is not a character flaw. It is not a weakness. It is not even excessive kindness, though it wears that mask convincingly. It is a learned survival strategy, built in response to fear, reinforced by experience, and running almost entirely below the level of conscious thought. And until you understand the mechanism, you cannot interrupt it. That's what this is about. Meet William. 31 years old. Project coordinator at a mid-size marketing firm. By most external measures, he's doing fine. He's reliable. Liked. The kind of person his manager describes as a real team player, and means it as a compliment without noticing the weight that phrase carries. William is good at his job, but what he's genuinely exceptional at is this: being available. It's Tuesday morning, and his colleague Marcus has just sent him an email asking if William can take over the client deck that was supposed to be Marcus's responsibility. Marcus has too much on his plate. The deadline is Thursday. The ask is not small. Inside William's head, in the space between reading the email and responding to it, something moves quickly. Thursday. That's 2 days. I already have the Henderson report due. And the weekly recap. And I was supposed to leave early Thursday because, actually, I can probably move that. It's fine. Marcus wouldn't ask if he wasn't actually stuck. If I say no, he's going to be stressed all week and it'll be awkward. It'll just be easier to say yes. I'll figure it out. The email takes 4 seconds to write. The resentment takes about 4 hours to arrive. This is not a story about a bad day. This is William's default mode. Last month, he agreed to train a new hire during a week when his own workload was already unsustainable, because his manager thought he'd be great at it, and the suggestion had landed as something closer to an expectation. 2 months before that, he canceled dinner with a close friend, the 3rd time in a row, because a work call ran long. The friend stopped reaching out after that. William noticed. He felt bad about it. He also didn't address it, because addressing it would have required a conversation he didn't know how to start. His evenings belong to other people's emergencies. His weekends get negotiated in real time. His sense of what he actually wants, what he would choose freely, without any social pressure, has become genuinely difficult to locate. And the most important detail about all of this? William considers himself a helpful person. He takes a quiet pride in being someone others can count on. The yes he gives isn't experienced as a loss. It's experienced as contribution, as identity. That reframing, that conversion of a fear response into a character virtue, is one of the most sophisticated things the human mind does. And it is exactly what makes this pattern so difficult to break. To understand why William says yes, you have to go back much further than William. You have to go back to a version of human existence where social rejection wasn't uncomfortable, it was fatal. For most of human evolutionary history, survival was not an individual project. It was a collective one. Food, shelter, protection from predators, the ability to raise offspring. All of it depended on belonging to a group. Being inside the circle of a tribe. Exclusion from that circle was not a metaphor for loneliness. It was a death sentence. What this means, functionally, is that the human brain evolved to treat social rejection as a threat equivalent in seriousness to physical danger. The same neural circuitry, the same alarm system, the same fight or flight cascade that activates when you encounter something genuinely dangerous. Research in social neuroscience has demonstrated this repeatedly. Social pain and physical pain share overlapping neural pathways. Being excluded from a group activates the same regions of the brain as being physically hurt. This is not metaphor. This is neurobiology. So when you feel that spike of anxiety in the moment before saying no, that quick internal recoil, that involuntary hesitation, your brain is not being irrational. It is doing exactly what it was built to do. It is scanning for threat. It is registering that a no, a refusal, a limit, a moment of prioritizing yourself over another person's expectation could produce a negative reaction. Disapproval, withdrawal, conflict, distance, and that those outcomes, however minor they might seem to the rational adult mind, register somewhere older in the brain as potential exclusion. The brain does not easily distinguish between this person might be annoyed with me and this person might remove me from the group. At the level of threat detection, they feel disturbingly similar. This is the invisible force operating behind the automatic yes. Not a choice to be kind. Not a character trait of passivity. A neurological alarm responding to the perceived social risk of disappointing another person. And here is what makes it particularly insidious. The response is largely automatic. William does not sit down, weigh his options, and consciously decide that keeping Marcus happy is worth the cost of his Thursday evening. That sequence never actually happens. What happens is faster than that. It happens before language. Before deliberation. The request arrives. The threat detection system activates. The body begins to orient toward the path of least social risk. And the verbal output, yes of course, no problem, emerges as the solution before William's prefrontal cortex has had a chance to fully assess whether it's actually what he wants to do. The yes feels like a choice. It is closer to a reflex. Now let's be precise about something. Fear of rejection doesn't just influence behavior at the moment of a request. It operates as an ongoing control mechanism, one that shapes behavior continuously, preemptively, sometimes without any direct social trigger at all. This is the distinction that matters. When we say someone is influenced by fear of rejection, we imagine them in a specific moment. Someone asks, they feel afraid, they comply. A linear sequence. But the actual architecture is more ambient than that. People with a highly active fear of rejection don't just respond to social threats, they anticipate them. They run constant background calculations. How will this be received? What reaction will this produce? If I do this, will they pull away? This anticipation shapes behavior long before any request has been made. It shapes how you speak in meetings, how you phrase emails, what you volunteer to do without being asked, how much space you allow yourself to take up in any given room. You are not responding to rejection. You are preemptively engineering your behavior to avoid its possibility. I should ask Marcus why this always lands on me. But if I say something, he'll think I'm being difficult. And then it gets weird for the whole team. Better to just handle it. I'll bring it up another time. This is the control mechanism in operation. Marcus has not threatened William. Marcus has not said anything hostile. But William has already run the internal simulation, anticipated the discomfort, modeled the social consequence, and made the decision to absorb the cost rather than risk the reaction. He is not responding to Marcus's behavior. He is responding to a predicted version of it. And here is where this becomes structurally significant. Over time, the people around someone like William learn not through any explicit agreement, but through accumulated experience that he can be relied upon to absorb. That requests will be met. Those limits are flexible. The answer is usually yes. This creates a social dynamic that is self-reinforcing in a specific way. Williams' compliance doesn't just solve the immediate request, it communicates something about what is permissible, about where Williams' edges are, about how much of his time and energy is, in practice, available to others. And once that communication is established, it is very difficult to revise. Because revising it, asserting a limit that wasn't there before, requires producing exactly the discomfort that the entire behavioral pattern was designed to avoid. You are not choosing freely. You are predicting social penalties and adjusting your behavior in advance to avoid paying them. This is not a weakness. This is not niceness. This is a sophisticated control system, running on fear, optimized for social safety, and it is costing you more than you realize. Let's trace the mechanism from the beginning. Because what makes this pattern particularly durable isn't just that it exists, it's that it feeds itself. Every iteration reinforces the next. And each reinforcement makes departure from the pattern feel slightly more threatening than it did before. Here's how the loop runs. 1. A request arrives. It might be small. Cover this shift, take this call, do me a favor. It might be substantial. Size almost doesn't matter in the initial moment. What matters is the split-second activation. What happens if I say no? The answer that comes back, automatic, pre-verbal, is some version of something bad. Disapproval, tension, withdrawal. The precise content varies by person and context, but the valence is consistent. Negative social consequence. So you say yes. 2. Immediately after saying yes, something releases. The tension that spiked in the moment of the request, that brief activation of the threat system, subsides. You avoided the potential conflict. You preserved the relationship. The social risk was neutralized. This is a real reward. Your brain registers it as one. The discomfort was incoming, and your behavior made it go away. This is the short-term structure of the pattern. Yes produces relief. And relief, behaviorally, is a powerful teacher. The brain notes, this worked. This kept the peace. Do this again. 3. But the relief doesn't last. Because the yes came with a cost. Your evening. Your bandwidth. Your Thursday. Your autonomy. And when that cost becomes apparent, as it always does, something quieter than anger but more persistent arrives. Frustration. Not at any specific person, usually. More diffuse than that. A low-grade sense of being someone whose choices are never entirely their own. 4. Here is where the loop becomes structural rather than episodic. Because each time you say yes, you communicate something about who you are. Not in words, in pattern, in behavior, in the accumulated experience others have of interacting with you. Your identity begins to organize around your availability. You become the reliable one, the one who always comes through, the person who never makes it difficult. These are, on the surface, flattering descriptions, but they function as expectations. And expectations, once formed, create their own pressure. 5. Now the cost of saying no has increased. Not just because of the immediate discomfort, but because a no, at this point, violates an established identity. It surprises people who have organized their expectations around your pattern. Saying no now doesn't just risk disapproval. It risks disrupting the social role you have built over time, inadvertently, through compliance but built nonetheless. What started as a strategy to avoid discomfort has become an identity. And identities are not just patterns of behavior, they are structures that resist change. This is why people who know, intellectually, that they need to set limits still find it extraordinarily difficult to do so. They are not just interrupting a habit. They are contradicting themselves in front of other people. And that, for a brain wired to fear social rejection, is one of the highest stakes actions imaginable. The hidden cost. 14 to 1800 hours. The costs of this pattern are usually framed in external terms. Overwork. Loss of time. Cancelled plans. The slow erosion of a personal life under the accumulating weight of other people's priorities. These costs are real, but they're not the most significant ones. The most significant costs are internal, and they develop slowly enough that most people don't identify the cause. Cost 1. Time and energy. Not just the hours spent doing things you didn't want to do, though those are real, but the cognitive cost of continuous availability. When you cannot say no, you are never fully off. You are always potentially on call. Every phone notification carries possible obligation. Every social interaction carries the background hum of, what might be asked of me here, and how will I handle it? This ambient vigilance is exhausting in a way that doesn't show up in any time-tracking spreadsheet. Cost 2. Self-respect. Self-respect is not, primarily, something others give you. It is something you generate through your own behavior, specifically, through alignment between what you value and what you do. Every time you act against your own preference to avoid someone else's reaction, you register that misalignment. Not loudly, not consciously, usually, but the registration happens. I didn't want to do this. I knew I didn't want to do this. And I did it anyway. Repeated consistently over months and years, this produces a particular kind of internal erosion. Not depression, necessarily. Not crisis. Just a slow diminishment of confidence in your own judgment. A creeping sense that your preferences are the last factor in any equation involving your own life. Cost 3. Resentment. When you chronically absorb requests you didn't want to accept, the resentment that builds doesn't always land on the person who made the request. It often lands on yourself. Because somewhere you know, even if you've never made it explicit, that the yes was yours. That you were the one who couldn't hold the limit. That the other person didn't force you into anything. And that self-directed resentment is harder to address than ordinary frustration, because it carries a secondary layer. Why can't I just say what I want? What's wrong with me? Cost 4. Identity restructuring. The cost is not just external. It restructures how you see yourself. If your behavior, across hundreds of interactions, over months and years, has consistently communicated that your time and energy are available to others, eventually your self-concept begins to incorporate that message. You begin to experience yourself as someone without limits. Not because you don't want them, but because the evidence of your own behavior suggests you can't hold them. This is the deepest cost. Not what you've lost to other people, but who you've slowly become, in response to the accumulated pattern of giving yourself away. If I say no, people will reject me. Let's take this apart. Because this belief, this specific, often unspoken prediction, is the cognitive architecture beneath the entire pattern. And like any belief, it is worth examining what percentage of the time it is actually true. The belief is not irrational. That's important to say clearly, and without condescension, because a lot of psychological advice treats this kind of belief as a simple cognitive distortion. Something obviously wrong that you should recognize as obviously wrong and thereby stop experiencing. That framing is both inaccurate and unhelpful. The belief is sometimes true. Some people will, in fact, respond to a no with withdrawal, with coldness, with reduced warmth or changed behavior. Some relationships are structured, explicitly or implicitly, around one person's availability and accommodation. When that availability changes, the relationship shifts. Sometimes it ends. This is real. It happens. And for someone who has experienced it, especially early in life, especially in a context where the relationship that withdrew was one they depended on. The fear that it will happen again is not a distortion. It is a learned expectation based on actual experience. But here is where precision matters. The question is not whether rejection ever follows a no. The question is whether it always does. Or whether it does as often as the fear suggests. Or whether the relationships in which it happens are the relationships most worth preserving. The fear generalizes. It takes evidence from specific experiences, often early, often high stakes, often in contexts where the power dynamic made rejection genuinely dangerous, and applies that evidence universally. To every relationship. To every request. To every moment of potential limit setting. And that generalization, over time, becomes indistinguishable from reality. Not because it's accurate, but because it's never tested. The belief persists not because it's always confirmed, but because the behavior designed to prevent confirmation never allows it to be disproven. If you always say yes, you never find out what would have happened if you'd said no. Now, the harder thing to say. Not all relationships survive limits. This is not a distortion. This is sometimes true. And part of the work, part of the genuine difficulty of changing this pattern, is developing the capacity to hold that truth without letting it determine everything. Because a relationship that cannot survive a no is not a structurally sound relationship. It is one that exists, in part, on the condition of your compliance. Which means it is not, in any complete sense, a relationship between two autonomous people. It is something more transactional and less stable than it appears. Relationships without limits are not deeper than relationships with them. They are structurally weaker. They are built, in part, on the suppression of one person's authentic responses. This doesn't make them worthless. It makes them incomplete. And it means that the yes sustaining them is not, in the long run, actually protecting them. Something has been happening to William over the past few weeks. Not a revelation. Not a dramatic shift. Something more gradual and more uncomfortable than that. He has started noticing the pattern. Not during the moment of compliance. The yes is still automatic, still fast. But afterwards, more consistently than before, he's catching himself. Watching the sequence from a small remove. Seeing it for what it is. I didn't have to do that. I was the first one to speak because I couldn't stand the silence. Not because I wanted to organize the event. Because I couldn't sit with the discomfort of no one saying anything. This noticing, this capacity to observe the mechanism while it's running, is not a small thing. It doesn't stop the behavior. Not immediately. Awareness doesn't function as an off switch. But it creates something that wasn't there before, a gap. Awareness creates a gap between the impulse and the action. And a gap, however small, is the precondition for choice. Without it, the loop runs uninterrupted. The request arrives, the threat activates, the yes emerges, and the entire sequence has completed before any part of it was available to reflection. But when William begins to notice, I'm about to say yes, and I don't want to, and the reason I'm saying it anyway is because I'm afraid of what happens if I don't, the loop pauses. Just briefly. Just enough. There's a second thing that happens at this stage, and it's more uncomfortable than the awareness. William begins to see that what he has called kindness is not entirely kindness. Some of it is. Some of his helpfulness comes from a genuine place. An actual investment in the people around him, an authentic satisfaction in contributing. But some of it, maybe more than he's comfortable admitting, is self-protection. The yes isn't only generosity. It's also management. Management of other people's reactions. Management of the social temperature in the room. Management of his own anxiety. If I'm honest, and I'm only being honest because no one can hear this, some of the reason I always say yes is because the alternative feels unbearable. Not because I'd be devastated if Marcus was annoyed with me, but because I can't stand the feeling in the room when I've disappointed someone. Even for a second. I'd rather take on 2 days of extra work than sit in that feeling for 30 seconds. This realization lands differently than the awareness of the pattern. The pattern feels like something outside you, a thing that's happening to you. But this, the recognition that the yes is partly self-serving, lands as something about you. About the specific shape of your discomfort and what you've been doing to avoid it. That's uncomfortable. But it's also, quietly, the beginning of agency. Because if you are the one managing the anxiety, if the behavior is yours, in service of your own relief, then it is, at least in principle, yours to change. There is a version of this section that would give you a 5-step framework and a motivational close. This is not that version. Because the behavioral reality of changing a deeply conditioned response pattern is not clean. It is not linear. It does not happen because you understand it intellectually, although understanding is where it begins. What it requires is the repeated, uncomfortable practice of doing something different, in small increments, in low-stakes contexts, and with the full expectation that it will feel wrong at first. Not wrong because it is wrong. Wrong because the brain has learned, across hundreds of iterations, to associate the alternative with threat. And relearning that association takes time and repetition. Intervention 1. The delay. Not a no, initially. Just a pause. Let me check my schedule and get back to you. I'll have a look at what I've got going on and follow up. These phrases do not commit. They do not refuse. But they interrupt the automatic response loop at the earliest possible point. They insert a gap between the request and the answer. This matters because the automatic yes bypasses deliberation entirely. The delay doesn't guarantee a different outcome, but it guarantees a moment of actual consideration. It creates the space for a question that the automatic response never asks. Do I actually want to do this? That question, simple as it sounds, is genuinely novel for someone operating on the pattern we've been describing. Because they don't usually ask it. They ask, what happens if I don't? And they answer that question so quickly, and with such conviction, that the first question never comes up. Intervention 2. Discomfort tolerance. This one is harder. Because the discomfort produced by not immediately complying, by sitting in the uncertainty of having not yet answered, by allowing the possibility of a no to exist in the space, is real. It is physiological. It is the activation of the same threat system we've been discussing throughout. And the instinct is to resolve it as quickly as possible. By saying yes. By sending the email. By filling the silence. The practice, and it is a practice, not a one-time act, is to sit in that activation without immediately acting on it. Not to deny the discomfort. Not to push it down or perform calm you don't feel. Just to let it exist without allowing it to automatically dictate your response. This feels terrible. This silence while I haven't responded feels genuinely terrible. And it's probably going to feel terrible for another hour. And I'm going to leave it and not email back yet and let it feel terrible. This is the core of the behavioral shift. Not a technique for making it comfortable, but a practice of proving to the nervous system, incrementally, that the discomfort is survivable. That the anxiety will peak and then recede without the worst prediction coming true. That the threat is not as large as the alarm suggests. Intervention 3. Calibration. Start with low-stakes situations. Not the relationship you're most afraid of disappointing. Not the request that carries the most social weight. Not the context where the consequences of a no feel genuinely significant. Start with the request that carries almost no consequence. The colleague you barely know, the optional commitment, the favor that could easily go to someone else. The purpose is not to solve the hardest problem. The purpose is to accumulate evidence. Evidence that the no did not destroy anything. That the relationship survived. That the person found another solution. That the anxiety, which felt prophetic, was in this case wrong. Each piece of evidence recalibrates the threat assessment slightly. Not completely. Not permanently. But incrementally. And incrementally, over time, is how the nervous system learns. These interventions do not target the fear directly. They interrupt the automatic response at the point of output, the behavior, while allowing the nervous system to have the experience of surviving the discomfort. They work not by changing what you feel, but by changing what you do while feeling it. There is a tendency, in content like this, to reach the behavioral change section and pivot to a clean, positive resolution. The character overcomes the pattern. Relationships improve. Life opens up. That version is not false. But it is incomplete. Because the reality of changing a deeply conditioned social pattern involves genuine costs, alongside the genuine gains. And a script that doesn't account for those costs is not preparing you for the actual experience, it is selling you something easier than what is true. So let's be accurate about both sides. What actually improves? The first thing that changes is the quality of time. When you are no longer absorbing everything reflexively, the time and energy you retain becomes more genuinely yours, not just in quantity but in character. You are present in it in a way that overcommitted time never is. There is a change in how decisions feel. Not dramatic, but the experience of choosing from preference rather than from avoidance has a different texture. It accumulates into something that gradually begins to resemble self-trust. Relationships, interestingly, often deepen when limits are introduced, particularly in relationships with people who actually value you as a person rather than as a function. Because when you start to say no sometimes, your yes becomes meaningful. It begins to communicate something real. I want to do this, rather than I couldn't figure out how to decline. What gets harder? Some people will not respond well to the changed pattern. This is real. And it is worth saying plainly rather than burying it in a footnote. People who organized their expectations, consciously or not, around your availability will experience the change as a disruption. Some will express that directly, as frustration or disappointment. Others will communicate it indirectly, through reduced warmth or changed behavior. This is uncomfortable. It activates precisely the fear that the old pattern was designed to prevent. He's annoyed. I can tell from the tone. And I need to resist the impulse to fix it by just saying yes. The thing he's annoyed about is that I didn't do something I genuinely couldn't do. That's his discomfort to have. There will be a period, and this period is not brief, where saying no feels worse before it feels better. Where the discomfort you experience from holding a limit exceeds the discomfort you would have experienced from just complying. Where the short-term calculation makes the old pattern look like the rational choice. This is the narrow gate through which change actually passes. Losing approval is often the price of gaining autonomy. Not always. Not in every relationship. But often enough that it's important to name it rather than paper over it. Some of what you've been managing with your compliance, some of the social smoothness, the universal likability, the reputation for being effortlessly agreeable, will be disrupted. And that disruption is not a sign that you're doing it wrong. It is the cost of doing it at all. Let's return to where we started. That moment, before you answer. The half-second of internal calculation. The yes forming before you've consciously decided anything. Now you know what's happening inside that moment. Not weakness. Not excessive kindness. Not a failure of willpower or a character flaw in need of correction. A survival mechanism, old, efficient, and operating largely outside the reach of conscious thought, doing exactly what it was built to do. Scan the social environment for the path of least rejection risk, and orient your behavior accordingly. Your brain is trying to protect you. That is not a metaphor. That is a functional description of what the threat detection system is doing in that moment. It is reading the social terrain and responding to a perceived threat with a behavioral output designed to neutralize it. The problem is not that your brain is broken. The problem is that the protective strategy, shaped by experience, reinforced by relief, calcified into identity, has become a pattern that operates independently of your actual preferences. You say yes not because you want to. You say yes because the alternative activates something old and urgent in you, something that registers social risk as a genuine threat and mobilizes your behavior to avoid it. Here is the question this leaves you with. Not a call to action. Not an instruction. A question. If the decisions you make about your own time, your own energy, your own commitments, if those decisions are being driven, primarily, by the management of anticipated rejection, are they actually your decisions? There is a version of your life where that distinction doesn't matter, where the outcomes are good enough, the relationships functional enough, the cost bearable enough that the question never needs to be examined. And there is another version where the question, once asked clearly, becomes very difficult to stop asking. What would you choose, if choosing didn't require managing someone else's reaction to your choice?